Welcome to this conversation. Today we're diving right into some very provocative questions about Peter. You know, that iconic fisherman turned rock of the church.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the whole narrative, the denial, redemption, journey to Rome, and even that dramatic upside-down crucifixion, it's really something to unpack.
Exactly. So let's start right at the beginning. Was Peter even a real person? You know, most Christians obviously just accept his existence. But when you look outside the
hmm
Bible, things start to get rather shaky.
Right. I've noticed that too. There's no Roman record or any neutral contemporary account that corroborates his story. I mean, if someone was executed in Rome, you'd think there would be some archival mention, right?
Exactly. It's surprising given the magnitude of the claim. Take, for instance, in Paul's letter to the Romans, he greets a whole bunch of Christians. Yet, Peter's nowhere
Yeah.
to be seen.
And then you have scholars like Bart Ehrman who argue Peter probably existed based on the multiplicity of early sources, even if the evidence is, admittedly thin and contradictory.
Right. And then there's Richard Carrier, the guy with a PhD from Columbia, who suggests that Peter might have been a literary invention, sort of a mirror image like Moses or Elijah crafted
I
for
see what you
early
mean.
Christian symbolism.
That's quite a challenge to traditional views. So, if we're saying the historical Peter might have been more of, a legend than a person, what does that mean for the narrative?
Well, it kind of throws us into a gray area, right? On one hand, you got the early texts like Clement in the 90 CE writings mentioning Peter's martyrdom. But notice, they never get into the nitty-gritty details like where and how it really unfolded.
Right. And then there's Ignatius of Antioch from about 110 CE, who refers to both Peter and Paul, yet again in a very vague way. It almost feels like as if these early sources were more interested in reinforcing tradition than recording historical fact.
Exactly. It's like the real details were lost in a sea of legend. And then by the time you hit texts like the Acts of Peter in the late 2nd century, things get even more mythical. I mean, a story about Peter resurrecting a smoked fish? That's hard to swallow if you're looking for historical
Yeah, that really
accuracy.
stretches believability. And speaking of myth, what about the whole idea that Peter went to Rome? Catholic tradition holds that he not only went to Rome, but founded the church there, becoming the first pope. But, as you pointed out, there's no contemporary record of this journey.
Right. You see, even Paul's writings, like in that intimate note of 2 Timothy, never mention Peter being there. The scholar Raymond Brown has opined that it's plausible Peter came to Rome late in his life, but he also stresses that this is not something historians can definitively prove.
I find that really quite telling. It really is. And John P. Meyer in A Marginal Jew is pretty blunt on this. Peter's presence in Rome is just part of tradition, not, verified historical fact.
Yeah, and that's the crux of it. Once you start peeling away the layers, the account of Peter's journey to Rome seems to rely heavily on post-event church traditions rather than primary evidence.
Absolutely. Okay, now let's talk about the death of Peter. This part of the narrative is, incredibly dramatic. Crucified upside down during Nero's persecution after the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE. But then again, this account only surfaces in Origen's 3rd century writings, right?
Precisely, and then we have Eusebius in the 4th century repeating Origen's tale. But really, it's all just a copy of that earlier account. And then, in the 1940s, excavations under St. Peter's Basilica revealed bones in a shrine area.
Yeah, I remember hearing about that. That's right. And in 1968, Vatican archaeologist Margherita Guarducci even declared that those bones were Peter's based on graffiti and the burial context. But here's the kicker. Critics like Jasper Burns and, again, Richard Carrier argue that the evidence is, highly circumstantial.
Exactly. It's like trying to nail jelly to the wall. There's no inscription clearly saying Peter on the bones, no DNA confirmation, and the remains come from multiple individuals rather than a single identifiable
So it's
person.
definitely debatable. And I think that's where the real challenge lies. If Peter never actually went to Rome, or if he didn't die in that dramatic fashion, then a lot of the foundation of apostolic succession, which underpins the authority of the Catholic Church, is on really shaky ground.
Absolutely, that's a major point. The entire legitimacy of the papacy hinges on the idea that Peter passed on his authority after founding the church in Rome. If we can't confirm that historical detail, then it does raise some uncomfortable questions about the basis of that tradition.
Right. It makes you wonder about how history gets shaped by tradition rather than fact. Yeah. And it's interesting how history isn't always about what we want to be true. It's really about what we can prove or reasonably infer.
Exactly. In this case, we seem to fall short on solid evidence. We have hints, suggestions, and then later embellishments, but not the kind of hard documentation you'd expect for someone supposedly so central to early Christianity.
I mean, you'd expect a figure of that stature to have, more substantiation. Sure, but here's a part I find a bit challenging. While the lack of contemporaneous records does cast doubt, scholar Ehrman and others argue that the very fact that later texts rely on Peter's story might indicate that a real person inspired them. Isn't that a bit of a circular argument?
Well, that's a fair point. It's like saying we believe in him because he's believed in, which doesn't necessarily cut it for rigorous historical analysis. But at the same time, the multiplicity of later references does create a collective memory, even if it's shrouded in legend.
Yeah, I get that. So, to sum up, what can we confidently say about Peter?
Here's the cautious consensus. A figure named Peter most likely existed, but apart from early Christian texts, there's no solid independent evidence. He may have ventured to Rome, but there isn't any concrete verification of that, and his dramatic upside-down crucifixion. That's most likely legend rather than documented history.
Yep, that seems to be where the scholarly debate stands. And the significance of all this, if Peter didn't actually do these things, it's huge. I mean, the whole idea of apostolic succession really depends on his historical presence in Rome, right?
Exactly. If Peter didn't found the Roman Church as tradition claims, then the authority of the papacy becomes fundamentally questionable. It's a reminder that history often intertwines with, myth and narrative to build powerful institutions.
It really makes you think about how history is constructed. And I think that's the beauty and frustration of it all. The story of Peter is so powerful, a mix of faith, legacy, and legend. But when you look at the evidence, or rather the lack thereof, it forces us to question what we take for granted.
That's spot on. It's like peeling an onion. As you dig deeper, you uncover not just layers of belief, but layers of uncertainty. It reminds us that questioning isn't about doubting for the sake of it. It's about uncovering what can actually be substantiated.
Yeah, absolutely. So, in practical terms, whether Peter was real or just a myth wrapped in scripture remains an open question. And that openness is what really drives scholarly debate today.
Exactly, and it's a conversation that not only challenges long-held traditions, but also invites us to, rethink how we view religious authority and the foundations of belief.
Very thought-provoking indeed. I mean, it really puts into perspective how powerful narratives, regardless of their historical accuracy, can shape entire civilizations, don't you think?
Yeah, it does, and it's a call for continual examination. The more we question, the closer we might get to a more nuanced understanding of the past, however incomplete that picture
Absolutely,
might be.
questioning is essential. Well, this has been a really engaging deep dive into one of the most iconic stories of early Christianity. It leaves us with, more questions than answers, but that's exactly how history should spark dialogue.
Totally. And for anyone listening, it's a perfect reminder. Never take any narrative at face value. Always ask, is this evidence-based or is it just what we want to believe?
Indeed. Thanks for this fascinating discussion. It's always a pleasure to challenge assumptions and hopefully encourage more questioning.
Absolutely. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and remember, history is not just about what we know, but also about what we're willing to question.
Thanks for tuning into this conversation.